Hello, and welcome to Day 10 Revolutionary Actions, Napoleon's Wars, Part 2. Today, we're going to talk about some questions students had about the Battle of Waterloo. And a lot of this is in response to the video that was homework, which was to watch portions of the movie Waterloo. This is the last, or heading towards the last portion of the French part of the Revolutionary Actions unit. And here we are, days 8 and 9, Napoleon's Wars, and then day 10 will be the Haitian Revolution. The first question many students had was, what about the civilians? What happened to the people of any country when Napoleon or any army invades? And in particular, this was inspired by what happens to the Russian people who run away from the armies during the wars? What happens to the people of Moscow when the city is burned down? And what happens to the civilians generally during war? The short answer is that civilians suffer immensely from wars of all kinds. Napoleonic Wars, in particular, were fought in large fields, and this meant that they were fought on farmland owned by mostly, or farmed mostly by peasants. If a battle was fought on your farm and your crops were destroyed, there wasn't really a social safety net to help you out, and so often those people would suffer immensely. Hunger, homelessness, poverty, and all of the traumas that go with that would have been common as Napoleon cut his way across Russia and the Russian army burned and scorched the earth in retreat. They would have destroyed, the Russian army would have destroyed Russian property to prevent the French and Napoleon from obtaining it. In the city of Moscow, this problem would have been amplified and concentrated because in a city you'd have a far greater number of people who were displaced, as is depicted in the painting on the right. People in the foreground there displaced from their homes that have been burned down just to spite Napoleon. Where did the people go who fled? They would have gone to family and friends in the surrounding area, much like people fleeing from a wildfire or a disaster today, from a violent war zone today. These people would become migrants, they would become refugees, they would move to places where they had family or friends or just any place that had an opportunity for a new start, sometimes temporarily and sometimes permanently. Abdication. So, related to the idea of Napoleon quitting after his losses in Spain and in Russia, Napoleon does decide to abdicate. Abdicate means to quit. If the emperor or the king quits their job, it's called abdication. So the question a lot of students have is, when Napoleon was losing all these battles, why didn't he just negotiate for peace way before he lost so hard? Why didn't he negotiate for peace with Russia before losing? Why didn't he negotiate for peace with Spain before losing so many soldiers, their lives, and so much suffering? I think if you were here for our previous lesson, you know the answer. The answer is that his personality, his pride, his stubbornness, and his belief in himself as a general and his belief in his skills meant that he thought he could always snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, that he could always just fight a little harder and come up with another victory to come back from what seemed like inevitable defeat to a victory. When he was losing, he often came up with some of his best strategies, his best tricks, his best ways of getting out of a defeat and becoming the victor. So why didn't he negotiate for peace? He thought negotiating looked weak. He thought that negotiating looked like surrender, and he thought it would make his soldiers depressed and feel like they had been sold out. As it turns out, after defeat in Russia, etc., he abdicated and quit being the emperor. He retired, so to speak, to the island of Elba. Elba is a small island off the coast of Italy, sort of between Italy and Corsica, relatively near to France still. And this exile to Elba was supposed to be a more or less pleasant retirement for him. Yes, he would be on an island far from France. Yes, he would be supervised by an honor guard of 100 soldiers or so. But he was going to live in a nice villa. He would have servants. He would have, his wife, his family, his dog, whatnot, all the human comforts that he could want. And this painting here sort of emphasizes the beauty of the location. Yes, the weather can be kind of harsh and the land can be kind of windswept, but Elba is still a Mediterranean island with olive trees and grapevines and all that goes with that. And the other European nations were pleased with this. So the question students ask is, why were the other European nations, why did they prefer putting King Louis back, well, not back on the throne, but King Louis, the brother of the former king, that family back on the French throne? And the answer really comes from looking at this map here. So on the map here, you have France here, and all this purple area were the areas that Napoleon had conquered at the peak of his power in 1812. If you were one of these neighboring countries, you would be looking at a French king as a welcome replacement for the conquering imperialist emperor Napoleon. The king, Louis, was looking to be just king of France. He was not looking to be emperor of an empire. Also, it's worth pointing out that in 1812, 1814, in this time period, almost all the other countries in Europe were ruled by monarchs. Denmark, Finland, Austria, Bavaria, Prussia, Norway, Hungary, Spain, the British, the Kingdom of Tuscany, Russia, all these places were led by monarchs. And so putting a monarch back in charge of France was a return to normal, a return to stability. It's also worth pointing out that some scholars, controversially, have referred to Napoleon as kind of the Hitler of the 19th century. He was seen as being a sort of megalomaniacal, narcissistic dictator who was bent on taking over all of Europe, which is true. He did want to kind of take over all of Europe and tell everyone what to do. When you view it from that perspective, the other European nations would prefer a conservative King Louis to a bold, conquering dictator like Napoleon. That said, he was pretty popular with the army still, and eventually he, quote unquote, escaped. He leaves Elba and returns to France. When he gets to France, you can see in this picture here, what supposedly legendarily happened is that the king sent the army to arrest him, and when the army got to him, they acclaimed him their ruler, and the king was deposed again. With Napoleon back in power in France, the rest of the European countries were furious and terrified. To go back to the analogy, if you imagine halfway through World War II, Adolf Hitler retired to an island somewhere, people may have celebrated, but if he returned, then the rest of the Allied forces would have responded with even greater force against him. And this is what happens. So the major battle that happens to kind of wrap up the end of Napoleon's career is the Battle of Waterloo. It's fought near the town of Waterloo, which on this map is just off the edge right here. The battle is fought here. This is a bird's eye view of all the things that happened. And as you can see in this painting, Napoleon was acclaimed as a hero by all of his soldiers, even this guy grabbing his leg. It kind of shows how much adulation he received. So students who watched the video had several questions about this beautiful reenactment of the battle. This up here is a screenshot from the movie. And so some of the questions, the main question that we're answering here is, how was the battle fought? How were Napoleonic battles fought? And then sub-questions, where did the commander stand? Why did they use drums? Why did they stand in squares? What's going on here? What is the strategy? So if you remember back to the earlier part of this unit, when we talked about the strategy of infantry lines of fire, lines of soldiers. It would be relatively easy if you had a just simple row of soldiers and a row of soldiers here. Uh, Not easy, but it would be possible to go around the backside and flank the soldiers. Like if these were soldiers and these were soldiers, and this is a much bigger scale picture, you'd be able to go around the backside and attack them. But if you put your soldiers in a square formation, then when the cavalry comes, they can't go around to the backside because there's more infantry facing outwards here. And if you go to the backside, there's more facing outwards here. And so you have a scene like this in the movie where the cavalry comes in and circles around and around and around, but there's no real place for them to break in, no vulnerable rear to the infantry. So they fight in squares to protect their rear. This means that there's no real backside to their group. Fighting in squares has happened since antiquity. The Romans and the Greeks, did this in phalanxes thousands of years before. And it works pretty well. As long as you stagger the squares so that they're far enough away that you're not in danger of shooting your own guys, you're far enough away that you're not going to shoot your own team. This is a pretty good way to protect your troops. The commanders would stand in the middle sometimes with artillery and drummers and other supplies, and they could issue commands to all of their soldiers to move the entire square, further north or south or whatever. Why did they use drums? So that's related to these squares. If you imagine that this whole square of people needs to hear the commands of the commander in the middle, and this square is made up of, say, 500 to 1,000 soldiers in a battalion, you're going to need some loud way to communicate. But this being the 1800s, there's no radio, there's no walkie-talkies, there's no other way to send messages. And they needed something a little more complicated than just whistles. So drums, bugles, fifes, other kinds of things like that can send loud messages to large numbers of people, sort of kind of in code, that'll keep all the soldiers in step, so to speak. Drums of this type, if you've ever been in a room with one, are very loud, and the drum beat can carry quite a ways. I know that if a marching band is practicing, or the drum line is practicing at a high school, you can hear it for almost a mile away. So Battle of Waterloo, I think that kind of addresses these questions. The Battle of Waterloo ends up being a strategic disaster for Napoleon. I know I said, imagine this is a line of soldiers, but instead imagine that these squares are not soldiers. Each of these little boxes is a battalion of soldiers, thousands of soldiers participating in this battle. Down here in the purplish blue is Napoleon's army. Over here is the Duke of Wellington leading a coalition of forces from other countries. Here's Blücher and his coalition of forces. And here's what happens. Napoleon is set up here, preparing to fight Wellington in the morning. But in the night, there is a rainstorm, and the field of battle out here, where they're going to try to do this, is muddy. And so when he gets up in the morning, you should have started the battle right thing first daybreak, but he waits and he waits and he waits because he wants the land to dry out so that he can roll his cannons so that his troops can move across the field easily. What this means is that during the delay, and by the time the battle actually gets started, Blücher's troops that had started off the day maybe 20 miles away are now arriving. And so Napoleon ended up having to face an enemy on two sides, and that was too much, and he failed. In a lot of ways, it seemed like Wellington and Blücher and the other commanders had learned from Napoleon's past battles, and they were using his own strategy against him. Our last question is, what was the true cost of the Napoleonic Wars? And this combines questions that a lot of students asked. And I'm going to use this picture as a symbol to kind of encapsulate all of it. So one eagle-eyed student made an observation in the movie. This was just like a 2-second long piece of the movie, and I tried to take a screenshot of it. A British soldier fell down during the Battle of Waterloo, and then their hand opened up, and then you can see this little object in their hand. And what this object most likely is one of these, a locket, that you could put a picture. You can see there's sort of a faded picture of a woman here. A locket that could go on a chain around your neck that you could put, underneath your shirt next to your heart, and you could take it out and look at the photos of your loved ones, your family, your wife, your girlfriend, your daughter, your children, your mother, whoever, someone that you love, that you've left at home. And this gets to the point of the true cost of the war. We could talk about how much money was spent on all of the weapons and all of the uniforms and all of the guns. We could talk about the 3.7 million estimated deaths caused by these wars. We could talk about the 45% casualty rate at the Battle of Waterloo alone. We could talk about all these things, just the numbers of dead, the numbers of money, but the thousands of people who died, but also the numbers of thousands of people who died from deprivation, from plague, from hunger, from homelessness, from being displaced because of these battles. At the first slide, we talked about what happened to the Russian peasants or the people of Moscow. They became homeless, they became refugees. This happened to people all across Europe. Wherever these battles happened, wherever armies were on the march taking supplies, the people around were affected. Also, there was a conscription law. Conscription is another word for draft. Military draft is when the government says you have to join the military. There was a military draft, conscription, through almost all of the time Napoleon was in charge of France. Starting in 1798 all the way through 1811, there were conscription of some kind in France. So for about 13 years, for a while women and men, and then later on just men, were being drafted into the French military, and they were being thrown into what some people have called the meat grinder, which is what these Napoleonic battles were like. Not only were these thousands and thousands of young men sent to battle, but in battles which had between 15 and 45% casualty rates, many of them were not going to return home. For those veterans who do return home, you have 13 years of people going to war and returning traumatized. And so you have nearly an entire generation of young men who return from war traumatized by the experience, but in a 19th century manner, which does not have a place for understanding PTSD or the shock of and trauma of war. There was likely to be an entire generation of men across the continent, but especially in France, who returned to depression, potentially suicide, potentially alcoholism, all of the things that we know accompany the problems that veterans face nowadays, with far less of a safety net and supports for those people. Also, the accompanying demographic loss, the accompanying loss of the next generation, because with a giant amount of young men dying comes a drop in the birth rate in the subsequent generation. If 15, 20, 30, 40% of the young men of France are sent to war to die, those are all young men who are not subsequently going to get married or start families. And so the true cost would amplify throughout the families and relationships of the men who died and suffered in these wars, even for those families that weren't directly affected by the battles themselves. Oh, and side note, there's no question for this one, but after merely 100 days back in power, Napoleon is exiled for good this time. And rather than being sent back to Elba, which is a relatively nice place in the Mediterranean close to France, he is sent this time all the way to the island of St. Helena, which is a barren, isolated place, no longer in a Mediterranean paradise so much as a stormy, isolated island in the Atlantic. Oh, and he dies there. All right. Submit your summaries. Check your missing assignments. Go back through, make sure you haven't missed anything. And your homework tonight is to read about the Haiti Revolution.